Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this ARK seminar. My name is Gillian Robinson. I'm Director of ARK. ARK is a resource with the aim of opening up social and political information in Northern Ireland. And as part of the work that we do, we run a seminar series which covers a variety of different topics, sometimes drawing on surveys that we've been involved in ourselves and presenting that material, other times inviting people from other research agencies in Northern Ireland to present, and as with today's seminar, inviting speakers from outside Northern Ireland to come and share some of the research that they've been doing. The theme of today's seminar is Disconnected Youth, Young People, Transitions and Social Exclusion, and this fits very well within the ARK portfolio of work, in that we have a particular focus ourselves on young people, with Dr. Dirk Schibutz leading up the work on the Young Life and Times survey. There's some information about that in your packs. That's work with 16-year-olds. And we also run a Kids Life and Times survey, which is a survey of 11-year-olds. So within ARK we have a particular interest in young people, and we're delighted that Professor Robert MacDonald, who's Director of the Youth Research Group at the Social Futures Institute at the University of Teesside, has accepted our invitation to come over today to talk to us about some of the work he's been doing. He's been involved in this area for a good number of years and has a number of different books and lots of publications to his credit that he'll tell us a little bit about. But we're very pleased that he's come to talk about this very important topic on disconnected youth. And so without further ado, I'll invite him to take to the floor, and then we'll follow that with some questions and answers and a light lunch. Okay, so thank you.
Well, good afternoon. And first of all, thanks to ARK for your very kind invitation to come and speak. It is really an honour and a real treat. It's my first trip to Belfast, to your wonderful city. Get the crowd on your side at the start. And thanks to Siobhan McAllister and Gail Neal, who've been my friends and my hosts, and have been helping me with my first tentative steps to exploring your place and your city and trying to get an introduction to it. Just a few words about me and this. There's my name on here, but just about everything I do is the outcome of collective work. I'm involved with a group of researchers at Teesside, a youth research group, and we research, broadly speaking, issues about poverty, exclusion, young people, youth transitions. I've included my email address there, and I am serious. If you want to talk to me afterwards, argue with me, challenge with me, say it's great, say it's rubbish, please get in contact, and I'll be happy to talk. The other thing I'd say at the outset is that I much prefer if people talk to me as I'm presenting. This makes it hard keeping on with time limits, but if there are things that I'm not clear about or people want to ask about as I go along, please do ask. Okay, what am I talking to you about? Firstly, what it's not about. This isn't a paper or a talk about the majority of young people in the UK, or indeed in Teesside, who make relatively successful, if a bit longer and a bit more complicated and extended, transitions from school to adulthood and to work. It's not about that or those people. It's about those young people who carry different sorts of labels and different sorts of names. We call them different things. We call them disconnected or disengaged or disaffected, the NEET generation, the lost generation, the so-called underclass, the hard to reach. This is a group of people of all sorts that carry the burden of representations. Those out here call them down there different things, and one of the aims of our research is try to get behind some of those labels and some of those words, to try to understand young people and their transitions in context of social exclusion, and to understand that thing we call social exclusion from the basis of their accounts and what they say and their lived experiences. The research that I've been involved with has a number of aims or themes to it. We try to be holistic, i.e. to be as broad as we can in our understanding of young people's lives. It tries to be longitudinal, i.e. we follow the same people over time, and also we talk to people gathering their accounts of their lives in the past and how they got to where they are now and their views of their future. It's qualitative research. We're not so interested about counting and measuring things. We're more interested in trying to attempt some depth and detail of understanding of young people's lives. And from the basis of research like that, to try to question common representations and theories and policies and practice that apply to young people. As I say, from the basis of, we hope, close-up research with young people who are living at the sharp end of socioeconomic change. And to use C. Wright Mill's famous phrase, to try to connect the personal troubles of individual biographies with public issues of social structure, and which is a theme or a notion I'll come back to towards the end of the talk. So, where is this place that we research, Teesside? Most people in England wouldn't know where it is, so I'll forgive you if you don't. It's not Deeside, it's not Teesside, it's definitely not Tyneside, it's Teesside. It's a conurbation, an industrial conurbation in the northeast of England. Dave Byrne, sociologist, describes it as one of the most deindustrialised locales in the UK. Middlesbrough, the main town at the heart of Teesside, at the time of this research, had the most concentrated poverty of all towns in England. By that, I think I understand that to mean that more of its wards were in the highest levels of deprivation than any other, or sorry, a greater proportion of its wards were in high deprivation counts than any other town in England at the time of the research. And the research that we've conducted has been in the poorest wards of this poorest town. So all of them are in the top 5% most deprived nationally. And two of the particular wards or neighbourhoods that we looked at were in the worst 5 from 8,500 in England. So not 5%, but in the worst 5. These are places then of multiple deprivation, places of high joblessness, of economic disadvantage, of people living lives dependent or using or reliant on welfare benefits, of poor skills, poor qualifications, ill health, high crime, problematic drug use and so forth. Combinations of clusters of disadvantage concentrated in one place. Now, one of the things you'll be thinking, I suspect, is how similar or how different is this place that I'm talking about to your places. And of course I'm very aware that not all poor neighbourhoods are the same. And this is one of the points that was made by one of the early reviewers of one of our texts, is that we can't claim that everywhere we talk about, every poor neighbourhood, every socially excluded place is the same. So just a little bit more on that. This is, and I think it is probably important for one of the themes that I'll be talking about, is that this is a place that is a relatively stable, predominantly white working class town. And I think that impacts upon and influences the experience of exclusion in this place. It's different to somewhere like Hackney, but it's probably very similar to other places in parts of Glasgow and possibly in Northern Ireland. Carrying on through this introduction, the American neoliberal social commentator, I don't like to call him an academic, a social commentator perhaps, Charles Murray, developed theories of the underclass based on US and a little bit of UK thinking and writing. And when pushed by British social scientists to say, all right, where is this new rabble welfare underclass of which you talk? Where will we find it? We don't like the idea of this notion of a new rabble, culturally deprived underclass. Where will we find it? He said, Middlesbrough is one of the places you'll find it, which happens to be the place that I work and research. It provides a test case, a critical case study area for research about exclusion and the underclass. Well, so one of our themes is, are these young adults socially excluded? What does socially excluded mean? If they are socially excluded, in what ways and how does this happen? Are we really seeing a group of young people and young adults cut off from the economic and social and moral mainstream? Are these really disconnected youth? Or have theories and policies become disconnected from the realities of their lives? I'm going to be whizzing and summarising all sorts of research here, so forgive me for some lack of detail, but do ask if there are things that you need to know about how we went about this research. 3 studies, in broad terms, I'll be talking about. The first, Snakes and Ladders, first author Les Johnston, 2000. Second, Disconnected Youth, myself and Jane Marsh, 2005. And thirdly, Poor Transition, first author Colin Webster, They shared a lot in common. All of them were qualitative and studies of social exclusion and youth transitions. The field work carried out late 80s, early 2000s in some of the poorest neighbourhoods in England, as I've described. We like to think of these as critical case studies. So if we are to find this thing called the underclass, using the sorts of methods that we have, looking at the sort of place that we do, and looking at the sort of age group that we're focusing on, we're most likely to find this thing called the underclass and best able to explore what we might mean by social exclusion. The sorts of methods we employed were, I suppose, at the heart of what we do are biographical interviews, so talking to people in depth and over time and in detail about their lives and their understandings of how they got to where they are now. Reasonably sizable for a qualitative study. In total, in the first two studies, if you added up the samples, you're talking about 186 white working class young people, young men and young women, aged 15 to 25. The third study, Poor Transitions, followed some of the first two samples up by the time they were in their mid to late 20s. So 15 to 25 age group for the first two studies and 23 to 30-year-old age group for the last study, and following some of the first two sets forward over time. We did bits of participant observation, and we also conducted quite a large set of interviews with stakeholders, service providers, professionals who work with young people in these neighbourhoods or work with problems of social exclusion in these neighbourhoods. But predominantly, for my analysis, I tend to rely on the testimonies and interviews with young people. Any questions about how we did the research? Because that is probably it in terms of how I describe the methodology. It's very important, and I'm skimming over a whole stack of research, so if you have a question about the method, now's the time to ask. Yes?
Sorry, can I just ask you to speak into the microphone?
Oh, is this going to make it?
No, that's okay, as long as we use the microphone.
How were the young people selected for participation in the interviews? Did they self-refer? Did they self-select?
Good question. A very important question. Our parameters were you had to be in this place from these quite tightly defined neighbourhoods. So that's the first issue. You have to be of the right age, 15 to 25. And beyond that, we didn't have selection criteria as such, apart from a sort of theoretical approach in that we were clear that we wanted to talk to people who would be able to speak to the sorts of themes and questions we had. So if we'd ended up with a sample of people who were, none of whom had had any involvement with crime, for instance, that wouldn't be a particularly helpful or useful sample. So as the fieldwork progressed, we kept the sorts of themes about work, welfare, family life, crime, employment and so forth in our heads, and made sure that the sample was balanced enough to include people who could talk to those sorts of themes. How we got them was through different sorts of methods, via agencies of one sort or another, so approaching drugs advice agencies or colleges or training schemes as a first step to recruiting part of the sample. Secondly, from those snowballing to other people who would be referred by them. Oh, now we know what you're about, Rob. You need to go and speak to me brother. He'll tell you about this. So referring on to others. Those were the two main methods of recruitment. Does that answer it? Yes. Okay, thanks. Just a brief note about how we might understand youth transitions. By transitions, we're talking just metaphors of pathways or routes or journeys to adulthood. We see these as being, yes, of course, the outcome of individual agencies, people's choice-making decisions and actions, that that choice-making is informed by local culture, class culture, youth culture, and so forth. And also those choices and actions and steps are constrained by the structure of opportunities that prevails in a particular place. Analytically, we focused on 6 different aspects of transition. First of all, school to work, inverted commas, transitions of people's experiences of training, jobs, employment, unemployment, and so forth, which is going to be the main focus of my talk today. But also looking at people's family and housing and leisure and criminal and drug-using careers, and the interplay and interdependence between those different aspects of young people's lives and how one set of experiences impact and inflect upon another to create a transition to adulthood. In terms of analysis, We did the usual standard thing of cross-case thematic analysis across 186 interviews, comparing and contrasting what people say about this, that and the other, but also within case longitudinal analysis, trying to understand about how an individual's life might have changed over time. That's all introduction, findings. As I say, I'm focusing today primarily on people's labour market and employment experiences. One of the things in youth studies, perhaps in lots of social scientific research, one looks for change and new things and big headline findings about what's new in the worlds of youth. I think it's important to say things and remember things don't change sometimes. The experiences of school that these young people had were depressingly familiar. Those of you who know Paul Willis's famous classic study, Learning to Labour, written back in the early 1970s in a completely different part of the UK, had extraordinarily strong resonances with the experiences of school for these young people in Teesside in the late 90s and early 2000s. A generally disaffected and disappointed experience of school. And people leaving school at 16 with low or no qualifications for different sorts of destinations, low status, low quality training and educational courses, which often went unfinished, low skill or no skill, poorly paid manual or service sector employment, or to become unemployed, or NEET, as the current categorization is. So those were the typical first steps that people had after school. In terms of labour market careers, unsurprisingly, after school, unemployment was a very common experience for this sample and a recurrent experience. So people became, and then became later again, unemployed. More importantly, employment was also a common and recurrent experience. Now, this is an important theme for analysis of exclusion and underclass. We describe post-school transitions then as unstable, insecure, non-progressive, cyclical. A typical sketch would be leaving school, going on a youth training scheme, becoming unemployed, getting a job, becoming unemployed, getting a job, going on an FE course, getting a job, becoming unemployed, going on a new deal scheme, going on another new deal scheme, and so on. So imagine that's 16 to 26. That would be a typical sort of labour market profile. So what we're not talking about here is labour market exclusion. It's quite important to stress. We're talking about instead a form of marginality, of people moving in and out, of shuttling between, of never really getting very far, but taking steps in and out of the labour market and in and out of schemes of one sort or another. Let's talk a little bit about people's experiences and views of welfare on not being a dole waller. I don't know if there's a Northern Ireland equivalent, dole waller. This is a sort of local pejorative term in Teesside for somebody who might prefer to remain on benefits, to be a lazy scrounger or whatever. Is there a Northern Ireland? Dole hopper. Okay. I learned the Australian is a dole bludger recently, but I'm not being... So, 186 interviews, the stack of transcripts that go about that high. We searched through them very carefully and in great detail to look for positive commentaries about the experience of being unemployed, a critical issue for underclass theories and theories of welfare dependence and social exclusion. There were virtually none to be found. 4 small snippets of interview we could find, which in some way talked about the experience of being unemployed in a positive way. Those 4 small snippets were all about very short periods of unemployment. What we found instead were strong working class views about the importance of self-reliance, of hard work, of family respectability, of not being a dole waller. And this moral, cultural commitment to work over everything else, over going on a youth training scheme, over going on a new deal program, over going to college, over being unemployed, this commitment to being in work and to being employed drove the sorts of choices and steps that people had. Nuna Murad found the same thing, I think based on research, if I remember correctly, in southern Italy. She found this same class-based work ethic and enthusiasm for work amongst excluded groups in continental Europe, describing its persistence in current times as remarkable. Now, this is really important to stress. This is despite the forms of work that people got. Despite the poor work, the low-paid, low-skilled, insecure jobs that people got, typically as factory workers, working in fast food restaurants, as bar staff, as care assistants, as security guards, as labourers, as shop assistants. This was work which was abundant. It was there. There was plenty of jobs like this, even in this high unemployment locale. This was work that people were easily hired into and easily fired from. Poor work at the bottom of the labour market. Polly Toynbee, in her book Hard Work, which was a sort of undercover investigative journalism thing about life in low-pay Britain, commented, "Low pay is fair enough if these jobs can be labelled entry-level, just a first step on the ladder, but very few move far. Few make it to the next step. They inhabit a cycle of no pay, low pay, insecurity. This, indeed, is the end of social progress." And in that comment, I think she summed up very nicely our findings. So our poor transition study, if you remember, followed people into their later 20s. And there we found that people were doing exactly the same sort of jobs, having exactly the same sorts of economically marginal labour market experience at the age of 27 that they were having at the age of 17. Where I won't talk about it today because we don't have time, but we're in the middle of a new study which looks at some of the same people and also at older age groups, so as to be able to answer the question about whether the same pattern applies at the ages of 37 and 47. We're describing then a pattern, if we think about these people in this place generationally and historically, we're describing a pattern of downward social mobility. These are the sons and daughters, or sons and granddaughters, of from families whose male members might have been described in the 1950s and 60s as part of the labour aristocracy, the top of the working class. These people had good jobs at ICI and British Steel, relatively well paid, relatively secure, the sort of jobs that were seen as being good working class jobs. Their grandsons, their granddaughters are now described as being at the bottom of the working class, the underclass, the socially excluded. So a process over time then of downward social mobility for this group. I want to just take a few steps to one side to think about a little bit more in more detail about how these patterns of labour market exclusion operate and happen. And here I'm talking about the role of social capital, social networks and place attachment. Now, remember, these are very poor, deprived places. By all objective scores, it'd be hard to argue that these aren't good places to live. There was a study done by JRF in 1997 which described one of these locales as the most miserable place in England to live. Martin, one of our interviewees, says, living here is brilliant. So a real disjuncture between subjective feelings about the place and objective labels and descriptions of the place. Part of that reason for that positive attachment to place can be understood in terms of what we might call bonding social capital, localized bonding social capital. By that I mean the bonds of trust and support and care of community, for using an old-fashioned word, that exist between people, between family and friends in this place. These forms of bonding social capital are often seen in policy discourses as problematic or the wrong sort of social capital. But here they were vital to making life livable under hard conditions. People looking after each other's children informally, loaning money, protecting each other from criminal victimization, reparation after crime, watching each other's houses to make sure they don't get burgled. If they do get burgled, knowing somebody will get your stuff back for you. Importance in job search, and in leisure life, and emotional support, and so on and so forth. So in short, we're talking very simply, very obviously, about a classed traditional way of life. A working class community that still exists and operates as a working class community in what might be described as de-traditionalized circumstances. Now, perhaps ironically or paradoxically, these forms of community engender extraordinarily strong senses of social inclusion. Yeah? So typically, as I would introduce myself, or our researchers would introduce ourselves to folk in these places, say, well, why us? Why are you interested? Poor? We're not poor. Excluded? No, are we excluded? Why are you interested in us? So a strong sense of normalcy from the inside, from the outside are abnormal and unusually hard conditions. And that these bonds committed or helped keep people in place socially and geographically. So in terms of job search, people of course relied on who they knew, not what they knew. So Lindsay, 17, says, there's this part-time job at the turkey factory. They're looking for people. I've asked this lad, because his uncle works there, to see if they want any more. Malcolm, 21, a New Deal participant, says, my dad says, tell Louise, that's my girlfriend, to give us the number of her gaffer. So he rang him and he said, oh, Malcolm, can start on so and such a time. So people got jobs through informal contacts, recommendations through who they knew. This restricted them, though, to the sorts of poor work done by those they knew. Kelvin and Jarrett, writing in the last period of high unemployment in the 80s, say, the value of informal networks militates against mobility. Networks, whether based in the family or friends, depend on people's roots in a locality. They take time to establish. Putting it more simply, Broderick, one of our interviewees, says, when we asked him about this, says, well, you're like friendly with everyone around the area, and if you go away, it'll take time, won't it? So that was part of an interview when I was talking to him about the sort of get on your bike thesis. Why don't unemployed folk, why don't you go to London? Streets are paved with gold. And his answer is, well, I don't know anybody there. How would I get a job? I don't know anybody there, because people they knew that the practice of getting jobs was through who they knew. Throughout the research and across the different themes that we are interested in, the power of social networks in shaping transitions was clear. And these social networks were locally embedded, culturally uniform and narrow. And they became increasingly narrow as the years passed. So as we interviewed people over time, we would find the social circuits, the patterns of association they had, who they saw would get narrower and smaller and more like them. So young mothers would tend increasingly to socialise only with other young mothers. The unemployed and poor workers tended to know only people who were like them. Heavy-end drug users and criminals moved with people who were also heavy-end drug users. And these loyalties, these allegiances, these associations and friendships had a significant influence on closing down a sense of who you are and who you can be, of the possibility of closing down the sense that there might be different steps that one could take, different identities or stories that you can tell yourself about who you are now and what your future might be. Trying to sum up some of our findings about labour market, I've put together, although I'm not a quantitative person, I thought, well, I'm going to make a little equation. So, this is what I'm trying to tell you. Old class-based normative values and practices, in terms of job search, for instance, in respect of real work, plus massive locally concentrated deindustrialisation, plus the continued abundance of poor work, plus poor quality welfare to work schemes which seem to shift people from unemployment to poor work, which itself then will shift people back to unemployment, comes together to describe and explain the sorts of poor transitions that we describe. Transitions of poverty and economic marginality, which last over time and which in some tend to describe a process of intergenerational downward social mobility. Coming to the end of the talk, getting back to C. Wright Mills's phrase, trying to think about how we connect up the biographical, detailed, unique life stories that we gathered, trying to make sense of them. And of course they were different and differentiated and unique, of course. And the differentiation and difference between them can, in good part, we think, be understood by how different sorts of hardship work together in young people's lives, how different sorts of critical moments might bash into those lives, how the different sorts of choices and agency that people have come together to create quite complicated, unpredictable and differentiated biographies under the same sorts of socioeconomic conditions. But while stressing and allowing and acknowledging that differentiation, what perhaps is most interesting is the uniformity of experience of the labour market that these people had. So one of the things that qualitative researchers always do is try to look for typologies to try to explain differences within their data. So you collect together the 186 people and look at their experiences of the labour market. I tried, but there's not a lot that's different. They shared an experience of being poor, of insecure transitions, of lasting poverty and marginality. And because of that sheer uniformity of that experience, I don't think you can begin to explain that experience by looking at individual agency and decision making. Something else is going on. And I think that something else is going on forces us to look upwards from individual lives, to cast our gaze a bit more widely, to look at the panoramas of economy and history, to connect up these biographies with public issues of social structure, which causes us to ask, what has happened here? Teesside's a fascinating place. It's a classic place. In 1840, how many people lived in Middlesbrough? Have a guess. You don't know. 40 people. 40 people. Can you believe that? Is that true? Yes, it's true. It was a small hamlet. During the 19th century, it became the fastest growing town in England. It boomed with the discovery of iron in the Cleveland Hills and the growth of the iron and steel industry and then the chemical industry. It was a very successful working class place during the 19th century and up till the first two-thirds of the 20th century. It was a place built for industry, built for workers, and a thoroughly working class place. The neighbourhoods we research wouldn't be in existence if it wasn't for those big industries like British Steel and ICI. Hugh Banian and colleagues writing in a book called A Place Called Teesside make the point that global capital sees Teesside only as a temporary space for profitable production. Capital moves around the globe looking for places to locate and seek profit from. But the people who live here don't feel like that. They become profoundly attached to particular places. These places come to have socially endowed and shared meanings which touch on all aspects of their lives. And those meanings help to shape who they are by virtue of where they are. So thinking in that frame, our interviewees, thinking about their age and thinking about history, they were born either on the cusp of or in the depths of extraordinarily rapid global local economic change between 1974 and the mid-80s. That's when they were born. Those global local economic changes and crises were shifted, deindustrialized their neighborhoods and shifted those social structural crises onto their individual life histories. But people retain old working class practices, habits, tastes, ways of getting along. And those give different subjective understandings and generate a sense of subjective inclusion and make life livable under new conditions of exclusion and insecurity. And the very final point is that these paradoxically then, that those processes of getting by, of making do, of looking after one another, those class practices from the past, simultaneously limit the possibilities of people escaping those conditions. They entrap people in persistent poor work and economic marginality. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rob. I mean, I found that really interesting. Could listen to you talking for much longer.
Okay.
Good. Well, what I think we'll do is see if people have comments to make, or perhaps questions for you, or comments from their own work. I know a number of people in the room are working with young people themselves and may want to sort of compare their findings in Northern Ireland with some of the work that you've done. Are you happy to continue to stand here for the microphone purposes?
Yes, probably,
okay,
yes. I was going to sit down, but then I realised that mic was
well,
there,
I can
yes.
move the mic if you'd prefer to sit.
Yeah.
Decisions.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah.
Okay, then we'll do that.
Thanks.
So if I could just open the floor to anybody who'd like to make a question, ask a question or make a comment, and if you can put up your hand and Brendan will bring the mic to you so that we can also record your question. Okay? Is there anyone who has something they'd like to follow up? Tina?
Hi Rob, thank you very much for the talks, very interesting. I was just wondering if any of the 186 people looking at individual biographies, if any of them actually escaped or made a different kind of lifestyle. And if so, like what was the resources that they were drawing on, or what made a difference to them?
Okay. Will that be okay? Can you hear me okay? Yeah. So, did any escape? Did any get out? Yeah. I've tried to give the broad picture and the broad story. There were a few individuals, and I mean less than one hand, who by the time we came to talk to them again in the poor transition study seemed to be doing a bit better. Now, in terms of escaping, I don't necessarily mean leaving the place, but being able to move perhaps a bit more upwards and onwards, perhaps. Yeah? To have more of a settled, perhaps a more secure, perhaps a better paid sort of employment history. There were 2 or 3 people like that. How and why? I have no idea, really, frankly. Now, that sounds a bit flippant, but so of course we looked very closely at their biographies. Were they better qualified? That would be the obvious. That's one of my colleagues, a keen educationist, argued that it must be about the power of qualifications. They were actually the least qualified. So it wasn't that. And if you look closely, and I think this is one of the nice things about the method, you can, the biographical detailed life histories, it's about chance and contingency. All those 3 happened to get work with employers who were sort of working in the social welfare industry in Teesside, which of course is a big industry, I suspect a bit like here, voluntary and community sector employment. Those were, inverted commas, better employers. Those were employers who might have a less punitive approach to their workers, who might have a more investing approach to their workers, who might actually help the workers that are in those jobs become educated and trained whilst working in those jobs. But the way that people moved into those was just about chance and contingency. So, but what it does tell us is that the quality of employment that is offered can make a difference to people's lives and futures. And it sort of speaks negatively back to the quality of employment that most people got. So there was a few, and it's about the importance of washing up with a good employer. And this is one of the themes that we're trying to pursue a little bit more in our current research, where we've got a much broader age span, where we're looking at people in their 40s and 50s to see if these are age effects or generational effects, whether people will be able to move out of this sort of insecure labour market transition through the process of time. We don't know the answer yet, but I suspect we will find as well that issues about employment retention and employment advancement and policies towards those are highly significant, and much more significant and much more important than simply welfare to work policies. The movement of getting people into employment seems to be a too wrong-headed and simplistic approach for policy. It's about keeping people in work and allowing people to advance through work.
Thank you. Very, very interesting, very insightful presentation. Just a couple of brief questions. You're following them up as they get older. What about the current generation that are in youth transitions? Does anything change for them? And just on another point, you mentioned at the start comparison, you mentioned London Borough of Hackney and that your sample were white working class. Is that significant to their experience?
Okay. First point, the current generation. I think things will be getting worse. I was doing a little bit of thinking and writing about this last week. The current project, we wrote the proposal to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation about 18 months ago. We said in it, it'll be really interesting to study these questions in improving socioeconomic conditions. Yeah? We started the actual fieldwork last September. At the time, well, a number of things were happening, obviously, but, you know, unemployment in the UK peaking 2 million last week. The conditions actually are going worse again. So if you compare unemployment rates or joblessness rates in the wards now, January 2009 is the latest data I've got, comparing them back to the time of these studies, unemployment rates are slightly higher now. So in general terms, I think what we'll be finding is very similar things and similar problems of people being able to make successful movements into the labour market for this group. Remember my very first point, I'm not talking about all young people, I'm talking about particular sections, particular probably class sections of youth. White working class, I suspect there are differences, yes. And whether one would find the same sense of uniformity, of inclusion, of community, of trust in neighbourhoods which were more diversified by anything, by ethnicity, faith, or whatever, I think is probably doubtful. And I think one of the themes that I've been trying to suggest is that that sense of social inclusion and sense of community and sense of support is partly allowed for by the fact that by the monocultural nature of the community that we're talking about. So we're talking about families who, you know, uncle lives there, sister lives there, dad lives there, granddad lives there, places which have, you know, whilst Teesside's a relatively new place, or this town I'm looking at is a relatively new place historically in terms of its history of population, these are communities which have stayed in place for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. People tend not to move, and that sense of knowing and being known allows for a sense of support and inclusion which might well be different in more diverse communities. What do you think?
I would tend to agree with you that those communities have sort of developed over a century, suppose century and a half, getting on for 2 centuries. Yeah. When you look at some of the London boroughs, or even some of the towns like some of the English towns, maybe Leeds and Bradford, which have much bigger ethnic populations, which are fairly recent, they haven't had that same opportunity to become embedded and established. And I think as well the fact that you have these variations in cultures, experiences, thoughts, religions as well, makes it very difficult for that type of environment to develop in those areas.
Sure. I mean, one of the criticisms that people make of the notion of bonding social capital is that it does keep people out. Yeah? And so those families on these estates who, for whatever reason, weren't in, and there was a minority who weren't in, and they tended to reflect just the fact that this was a new family or a new house, or moving to a new estate, would sometimes find it difficult to share in that process of inclusion and bonding, of course. So it's not a completely happy story that I'm telling.
No, I mean, within the Northern Ireland experience, there's a lot of interest in this post-conflict experience that we're supposedly going through at the moment. There seems to be some ignorance that, you know, within staunchly strong working class areas, the Troubles may have bonded communities by perceived religious background. Along the lines that you were maybe finding.
This is my first trip, and you know, forgive me if I say anything terrible. But one of my reflections as we were on an open top bus going down Shankill Road and Falls Road, it looks very much like where I work and where I come. It looks extraordinarily similar, apart from all these flags and murals. The feel of the place, about being a poor white working class place, was extraordinarily similar, apart from these divides which you have.
Okay, anyone else has a question or comment? Yes, the gentleman.
Well, first of all, Rob, thank you very much. I thought it was a really great talk, and very, tremendously clear in terms of the analytical as well as the descriptive material. So, thanks a lot. I mean, just on that last point, we're just writing up our work on the legacy of conflict and marginalisation, particularly in relation to poverty, in 6 different areas in the north. And the analysis that you've brought here is very, very similar to our experience. It would have very clear, strong overlaps. And what was particularly striking is the relationship between the complexity of a structural analysis being overlaid on the experiential. And I think one of the things, and this is more of a comment really, but one of the things I really enjoyed about listening to the talk was the dignity that you bring to the young people who you're interviewing, the fact that you are listening. So much of the research that's been done in the north here, and it is very much a transition from conflict period, but so are other communities transitioning from conflict. Where I'm from, Toxteth in Liverpool, for example, would be very similar in terms of the notion of transition. But what's really significant for me is hearing the voices and listening to those voices over time, rather than counting numbers. And I think we've kind of lost our way in the last 20 years in social science research in terms of meshing the agency, or the discussion of agency, the discussion of subjective realities, and the overarching structural analysis of capital, and by that I mean economic capital, but also the other issues that we would bring to bear on that, colonialism and patriarchy, for example, as being crucial. So there's kind of some discussion in that, but it was more a comment and a thanks.
Well, thank you. I mean, with a talk like this, I realised I was looking through it. Actually, there's very limited ethnographic material in this talk. I'm trying to summarise and say 10 or 15 years worth of research in about 30 minutes, and forgive me for having to limit some of that. But of course, I agree with everything you say. And there is a sort of argument you hear sometimes. Well, policymakers, they don't want to hear qualitative research. They only like numbers. I don't know if I believe that, actually. I think, from observations, I think if one, I'm not talking about myself, if one can develop research which is convincing to people, does tell people a story, and if that audience is policy people or people with power, they can actually listen and be convinced. Paul Willis's study, Learning to Labour, I don't know if those of you who know it, but I'm told it's the most cited, referenced empirical sociological book ever. It's based on, frankly, interviews and discussions with 12 young people. It's been extraordinarily, I'm not saying it's fantastic and perfect in every way, but it's extraordinarily influential book. And that's just on a small scale, qualitative study. So I agree with you, but I think we shouldn't be shy about trying to carry on. I'm not saying to ourselves, well, this isn't going to matter, or not going to have any influence, or people won't listen to us, or it won't get funded, because I'm not sure that's completely the case.
Just a question in relation to, it's quite interesting to talk. When you brought did you bring the findings back to some of the young people that you worked with, and this is where you live, and what was their reaction to the things that you found? How did they perceive that? Did they agree? Or, I mean, I think it's very telling the quote that you referred to, "This is a brilliant place to live," which there's a strong contrast to any other way of... Did you engage with that?
To some extent. We couldn't claim to follow some of the procedures and practices of research which proclaims itself to be participatory. But to some extent we would and we do, and of course we have to, because we're seeing people again and again, some of the same people. And of course they're sometimes intrigued, more often than not they don't really care, actually. "Oh, who are you again? Oh yeah, sure, come in." You know, I think it's important for me to reflect that actually they've got much more important things to be thinking about and doing than commenting on what we write about them. And that sort of hooks into that same feeling that actually people regard themselves as having extraordinarily normal and unextraordinary lives. But yes, of course, people were... And there are also really quite difficult ethical and political issues about researching people who are poor because they're poor, but who don't regard themselves as poor. You know, and I don't quite know if I know some of the answers to these. You know, like our current study is looking at people who, inverted commas, are currently poor. It's a phrase that the Joseph Rowntree Foundation use for people not who are persistently poor, not who are never poor or escape poverty, but who sort of move in and out over time around the poverty threshold, recurrent poverty. We need to, for our research, find people who fit that bill. What do you say to people? How do you introduce yourself to people? Especially, you know, Ruth Lister talks about how poverty and the poor it's the one reference group that nobody wants to be part of. Yeah? There's no political strength to be gained from. People don't march with banners saying we're poor. And how one introduces and talks to people about the things that we might want to say as sociologists, the sorts of analysis and words that we might want to use, which might be quite different to the words and analyses that they might want to give, is one of the tasks of being a sociologist, of being an analyst. So another, for instance, virtually all interviewees would regard themselves as, the masters of their own destiny. Yeah? I am in this position and it's my fault. I should have done this, I should have done that, I should have worked harder, I shouldn't have taken those drugs, I shouldn't have done this. Yeah? So very individualized, individualistic, non-sociological views of the world. Yeah? Whereas to us as researchers, you almost have to laugh sometimes, given the account of the hardships and pressures that have been brought to bear upon them, which we can understand from the outside, looking down and looking in and looking across these lives. There might be a more persuasive story to tell, which maybe takes account of these lives, which isn't about seeing these as about individual failings. So I don't know. You tell me. What does then one do if an individual has an analysis which would completely disagree with the analysis that we might give on the basis of the complete set of interviews that we have? I don't know. Do you know? What do we do?
Okay, we're coming to the end of our time. Is there any last pressing point that anyone wants to take up with Rob before we officially thank him? I'm going to take chair's action one more time and ask my own question. And I wondered, you don't refer at all to any gender differences in the findings. Maybe there weren't any. But I'm just interested from the sort of background of the working class society where these young people are now living. Are there gender differences and are there reasons for that?
No, of course there are. And it's an obvious question, and it's obviously not one that I haven't thought about. But there's partly a purpose to not doing that, because one of the discourses that we hear is about young men failing, young women doing okay. Yeah? And in the fuller version of this presentation, which I chopped some slides off, all the biographical accounts and quotations about poor work that I use are from young women. And that's partly on purpose to show that this isn't just a man's story. Yeah? That having poor work, poor factory work, poor work in a care home equally applies to, and again, trying to divide those labour market histories by gender didn't work either. Yeah? similarly, the experiences of school didn't work by gender differentiation. It would be more truthful to point to the similarities between young men and young women's experiences of school and of labour market than it would be to highlight differences between them. Now, of course, in other realms of people's lives, if I was giving you a presentation today about people's housing careers or family careers, then of course you'd be able to see very traditional and very predictable differences in about, you know, who defines themselves as a parent, who does the work in the home, who looks after children would be coming through. But in terms of young people's experiences of school and the labour market, these were predominantly similar experiences, and that's partly the reason I haven't promoted a gender analysis of them.
Okay, well, I think we've had a very stimulating and interesting presentation from Rob. His work is fascinating. I'm certainly going to take the opportunity to try to read some of your books in more detail now, and I know many people here may want to follow up with you over lunch. Just before I ask you to thank Rob, can I just alert you to two things? One is this is our last seminar in the current series, but we would appreciate you completing the very brief